When we consider the rising rates of obesity and cardiometabolic disease, and the fact that the available statistical models predict that the prevalence of these conditions will only increase in the years to come, it's clear that we still have a lot of work to do in the healthcare field. Now, I know this is a whole podcast episode in itself, but in your opinion, where have we gone wrong in our attempt to tackle the obesity epidemic? If we're serious about rectifying this global issue, what are the most critical areas that need to be addressed?
Oh, okay. How long have you got? Now, look, it's a really, really relevant question. It should be worrying a lot of, World Health authorities and organizations. I think, in brief, that we've placed far too much emphasis on the macronutrient content of the diet. We've been saying, you don't need carbs, or you need fat, or you don't need this, or you need more protein. I think that's somewhere where the message has got diluted. And I think if you walked down the street and picked 100 people off and said, is a high carb diet good, or is a high fat, there'd be much confusion. So that's the first instance. We've paid too much attention to just concentrating on the macronutrients. Secondly, I think as scientists, health, I think we've really got the message jumbled, and I think we are confusing the public. So I think the scientist has a role to play in educating the public. Thirdly, and they're in this with us, is the media. The media hops on, I'm not even going to mention your recent election, but the media hops on stuff like you wouldn't believe. And, I hate to use the word fake news, but there is a lot of fake information about there. It's no coincidence that your New York Times bestsellers lists are full of either diet books or recipe books. I mean, what's going on there? You've got a big problem there. So how to get the message across is very, very important. And as we've said earlier, there is no mention of the timing of food in any dietary guidelines. Now, your average person off the street isn't going to look at the national guidelines. So we, as scientists, you as people who put this out in the media and do a great job of providing scientific information, we have to educate. So I think the education is of vital importance. I'm not too worried what the message actually is, so long as the message is getting across and it's clear the message isn't getting at the moment. Maybe it's the wrong message, but it's also the way we're delivering the message. So I think we all have to sort of put our hands in our pockets here and put our thinking caps on and say, look, we could do a better job of educating everyone across the board.
I think where we went wrong is allowing the industry to turn our food environment into one of refined. They're not artificial foods because, the carbohydrate did come from a wheat grain or a rice grain, but stripping out anything of nutritive value, stripping out all fiber, putting it together with fat, often saturated fat, putting it together with salt, putting it together with sugar until we hit that bliss point, which I'm sure your readers have known about it. And then having something that is so hyper palatable that especially children, our adolescents, they prefer to eat that food over the broccoli. Big surprise, right? And unfortunately, I do believe these foods, maybe they're not addictive like a drug, but they do perpetuate, I believe, reward centers in the brain that make us crave them more. You stop eating these foods, you're not going to go into the same type of withdrawal as you would withdrawing from cocaine. But even so, in a way, getting off this hyper palatable, easy to consume, ever available food for many people is just as hard as stopping the smoking. And that's where we have completely gone wrong. And one thing that possibly is an important new piece of data is functional MRI is a relatively new procedure that allows us to actually look at blood flow to certain parts of the brain and knowing they're reacting stronger than other parts of the brain. And so this has allowed us to learn about certain things about eating in terms of reactions in the reward centers. And one of the things that seems most important to me is over time, with continued consumption of, let's say, a palatable food, what is going up is the reward reaction to images of that palatable food, that anticipating the eating of that powerful food increases over time. And the response that the researchers see in reward centers when they show pictures of palatable foods to people actually predicts how much weight they're going to gain over the next 15 years or so. Well, that's scary because our environment is full of images and actual sites of hyper-palatable foods. So it's full of advertisements for hyper-palatable foods. If our brains are reacting super strongly to those images and those reactions then lead to actual consumption of those foods, no wonder we have an obesity epidemic, because everybody looking at the availability of sugar and the availability of junk food, but also how much more advertising for hyperpalatable foods do we have now than we did 50 years ago when everybody was normal weight? Huge amounts. So that, in my mind, is something that maybe researchers need to start focusing on more. And I think we need to be doing studies, if it's possible to even do such studies, if we eliminate the advertising, if we get rid of the billboards, if we get rid of the product placement, is it possible we would actually see a reduction in obesity prevalence? I would love to know the answer to that.
That's a tough call. I think there's a lot of research that's being focused on what we can do with this epidemic. The epidemic in many ways, I think, is, again, a mismatch between our environment and our genetics and our epigenetics, for many people, not for everybody. What we see is that there's a lot of individual variability in response. And I think one of the things that we need to understand much better than we do is to look at why some people respond so differently than others. How is it that an individual here that is, has a modest amount of physical activity remains lean? What is it them that then could potentially be discovered that could benefit others? So I think understanding variability in responses to caloric deficits and caloric excesses is really key. I think gaining a better understanding of sort of the epigenetic aspects, gene regulation that sort of programs an individual to live with a metabolism that is fairly slow, and what could be done in that regard that could influence this. I think we need to find ways to help individuals deal with the highly palatability of food that is ever present. Let me give you an example. So here I'm in a nutrition department, and hopefully none of my colleagues will hear this, but and we have we have culinary labs where students will prepare food, and we can have, the faculty and staff have already eaten their lunch, but here's a culinary lab, and they put it in the lounge, some of the food that was just made, and some of it's, quite good. And we'll see sort of a beeline of faculty, of individuals down to the lounge to eat more food because it's available. How can we deal with this issue of availability without having some sort of natural disaster then that enables people to sort of, maintain enjoyment of food and the socializations that go with food, but at a lower calorie intake? And what are ways that we can then sort of modify the issue of this energy gap when people lose weight so that there's less hunger? It could be that dietary composition matters. It could be that, and I think one of the issues is that years ago, when we were told that, fat's kind of the enemy and carbohydrates, your good friend, we kind of went overboard on the carbohydrate, so that the increase in carbohydrate calories was disproportionate to the decrease in our fat calories. And this, led to overconsumption. And I think we really need to focus on, other ways that can help regulate our appetite. I applaud, the work on ketogenic diets, not because I think they're, great for everybody, but I think it started a whole new area of research that not only vindicated Atkins a little bit, quite a bit in some ways, but also looking at issues related to appetite regulation and issues related to total energy intake and even some dietary composition and its impact on energy expenditure. But I really think we've got to focus a lot on exercise and appetite regulation so that it becomes sort of front and center for the American public. I think that's going to be really important, so that, again, sort of the take-home message is that we don't oversell the importance of exercise, but we don't undersell it as well. We give the public a realistic understanding of how this could be quite beneficial, but it's going to probably mean for many individuals more than just a casual walk. And then I think we really need to focus on obesity prevention. I think we'll make much better inroads into this epidemic if we focus on prevention and not just treatment. But prevention is harder to do. And it's more difficult, and maybe it's not quite as exciting, because when we prevent something, well, nothing changed. This individual that was lean stayed lean, but I still think that we need to do that. And of course, much of this, in my mind, is going to involve public policy. And I don't know much about policy at all, but I really believe that we've got to make healthy choices when it comes to activity and food intake to be the best choices that are more convenient. So convenient choices that are healthy choices, as opposed to convenient choices that are unhealthy. Other than that, honestly, I'm kind of at a loss. I struggle with trying to figure out, okay, what can we do? This is such a huge issue.
We wouldn't be having this conversation unless the jury is still out. So the jury is still out on why we're getting so fat. Why is it so easy? All right. And I don't have perfect answers for you, but I can hazard a guess. I think that we've done a few things wrong lately. We make everybody work too hard, mentally and physically. We have very demanding jobs with long sitting hours. So some people say sitting is the new tobacco. So sitting for long periods of time, you can just imagine physically that is not good for all the organs that are tucked up above our hips. That degree of immobility is not good for it. So some people say just get up every hour, 5 minutes for every hour. I think you'll probably sit down and work a bit better too. So I of course I I want to encourage everybody to have healthy lifestyle habits, healthy diets, and healthy amounts of exercise, but not to go overboard on anything. I think sleep hygiene has been suffering as well as a result of working everybody so hard. So I would love someone, I think Sweden is doing it actually. They're doing an experiment in their public servants. They have reduced the number of hours that they have to work every day. And I think an advertising company in America did the same thing. They shortened the hours, working hours, to 5 hours a day. And what they found, to their shock, is that actually productivity and creativity increased when they reduced working hours. That people did come back to the desk and they did have better ideas, and actually that the advertising company made more money when they reduced the working hours. So I think this unfettered working, from dawn till dusk is doing some harm. So I would do something there. I would also make the focus of lots of effort in pregnant women, because I think obesity starts in utero. I think it starts with higher cortisol levels in the mum, maybe in the dad as well. Epigenetic effects, programming effects that program the appetite center of the baby's brain. They're born heavier, and they grow on a much higher track, above the 99th percentile for weight at birth, will mean that by 2 and 3 and 5 years of age, they're also on the 99th percentile, above it, for the rest of their life, and they will always struggle with weight, and it will have nothing to do with their lifestyle. It's just like if they were born to be tall. You can't really intervene in someone whose predisposition is to grow tall. It would be extremely hard to make them short. So pregnancy should be the efforts. And pregnant women are the most important people in our population, and we keep excluding them from research. But they really should be, the lowest common denominator should be pregnant women. That's where we should start. And thirdly, I would teach science at school. I would teach it in a way that is titillating. I would start with eggs and sperm. I would talk about DNA and RNA and all the components of the cell. The normal cell would be an egg and a sperm, so that gradually through the process of science education in high school, that they have an embedded view that it's important for that egg and sperm to be produced under healthy, ideal conditions. And so by the time they're ready to reproduce, that they might be ready to make some sacrifices in terms of sleep and alcohol and all the other things that young adults do. So I would love to see just that we start all that science education earlier and make it more interesting for them. And finally, if I was in charge of dietary guidelines, I would definitely put in something that says eat whole grains, not refined grains, and make sure they're low GI. All right? Make sure they're low GI. And the only way a consumer's going to know that at the moment is if the food labels are going to have the GI. So at the moment, if you want to lower your blood sugar, nothing on the label except total carbs will give you any idea. The sugars won't, the added sugars won't, the fiber won't, because it could be finely divided. So the only thing that will help at the moment to lower blood sugar levels that you can find on the label is carbohydrate. So you would be misleading people if you said eat less carbohydrate. If that was the take-home message, if you want to lower your blood sugar, eat less carbohydrate, I think all diets would suffer. The whole diet would suffer. So I think it's important to get a message that grains are good for you. They have lots of micronutrients. They're more if they're whole grain, but make sure they're low GI. So in Australia, we have a food symbol that tells them that this is a healthy food with a low GI.
Yeah, so I think it's become, for me anyway, and based on, you know, a huge amount of data at this point, it's become so obvious that the issues that we're facing really never had anything to do with diet. They do, but I think we are better recharacterizing diet as a symptom, and what it's a symptom of is, you know, an increasingly neoliberal free market economic model that has, so people say, oh, it's the dietary guidelines that was introduced in the 1970s. They're the reason. It's like, well, actually, if you look what really shifted in the 1970s, you know, it was the prevailing economic doctrine in a lot of countries, particularly the US and the UK. You can almost look and chart, and as some research groups have, the rates of chronic lifestyle disease, overweight and obesity correlate so strongly with those extremes of kind of free market economics. And, you know, wealth disparity within a society is the greatest driver of health disparity. Countries with low wealth disparity have much less health disparity. And all of these issues in terms of the diets that are essentially on people's plates on a day-to-day basis are majority socioeconomically and environmentally driven. We have reversed a situation where historically lower socioeconomic quintiles of society would have been prone to food vulnerability and insecurity. They still are, but they're also prone to, for the first time ever, be able to massively overconsume energy intake for essentially the lowest possible cost. And these are the issues that are facing us. We have areas, particularly in urban areas, that are food deserts is the term. There is not a supermarket selling fresh vegetables or fruit. Here's just an example. I know a lot of your listeners may be in the US, but the same broadly applies. There was a study last year in the UK that looked at the density of 4 major fast food outlets, so McDonald's, KFC, Burger King, and a Chicken Shack. The density of each of those outlets, all 4, relative to quintiles of social deprivation. And in the areas of greatest social deprivation, there was the greatest concentration of all of them. This isn't an accident. And so I think we need to start having a really hard conversation about the reality that the diet that we are producing, or industry is producing, and the marketing that they're using to get people to consume these diets are largely targeting the most vulnerable people in society. And it's at that level that we tend to see the greatest in cardiovascular, diabetes, chronic lifestyle disease risk overall. So I think we need to recharacterize this as a socioeconomic problem and start to think about regulation in the same way that there was a huge fight to eventually get the tobacco industry to behave somewhat responsibly. We now have to accept that the most logical analogy that we have for the food environment is that the food industry is the what to 2020 what the tobacco industry was to 1960. We have to treat emissions in the same way as these products are going out that are incredibly harmful for human health. They're marketed to kids as young as 1 to 2 years of age. Like this is everything that's wrong with the free market if there are no checks and balances in place. And so that's where we would make significantly more strides in a shorter period of time than 100 more years of research onto different diets and nutrients and foods.
Yeah, most people say we need to educate more. I don't think so. I think most people know that fried foods and chips and those things are probably not as good as vegetables. Everybody knows that. I don't think it takes education to figure that out. And I don't think you have to know the calorie counts on things. It does open people's eyes. So educating people is not the answer. Everybody will say that. Fitness people will say that. They're just wrong. I don't know what to say about that. What I would say is I wish I could say we could legislate that we cut out all these processed foods, but like then we get into Big Brother controlling our lives, and I don't think that's a good idea either. I don't have a great answer. I think we have to do something to prevent this in the first place, and if that comes down to legislation, maybe. I don't know. I wish there's a lot of issues. So like, I'm over here in San Diego, and if you go in my zip code, everybody's thin, white, and fit. And, obesity is not an issue here. You go down the road in a different zip code, and it's an issue. So it's not all money, but, it's complicated. Social economic stuff, it definitely plays a role there. And somehow getting people to eat mostly whole foods when they're younger. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to legislate that. I don't know. Parenting's different, but it's just complicated. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I know it's not education. That's for sure.
I think it's all to do with the built environment, or a huge part of it is. And people criticize the dietary guidelines and say, oh, that's what's caused people to eat incorrectly. And my response to that is, well, what are the physical activity guidelines and how many people actually follow them? And I lived in Houston for a year, and I've actually come back from living in Kuwait for a year. Both are cities where you can't move around much. And in Kuwait, I think my diet was the same. I gained 7 kilograms because the environment I was living in did not permit me to do the same amount of free living activity I do in London. So your environment is such a huge driver of the physical activity you take and what you eat. And if you consider, most of us are advertised to every 5 minutes of every day, whether you're leaving the movies, whether you're driving home, you're at the gas station, whatever it might be, you will be exposed to food. All of it will be really palatable, heavily marketed, designed in such a way to make us crave it. And my reason, or my thinking about the obesity crisis, is human beings really like food. If we didn't, we'd have died out long ago. And unfortunately, we live in an environment that puts that, on steroids, our craving for food and our ability to eat it. And I don't think it's any more complicated than that, really, for the vast majority of obesity in society. I worked at Imperial for 5 years, and they had a professor who was head of the Department of Medicine, who was an incredible obesity researcher and a very wise man. And he said, you should think about obesity like this. It's not surprising anyone's overweight at all. It's amazing anyone's thin. And I think that's the lesson that we all need to take. Actually, lean people are the minority now in most populations. And I think that tells you about what the major driver of obesity is. It's our environment.